Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and think tanks. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI. The CPI results are comparable across time back to 2012. This is because when we convert the original data to the CPI scale, we take into account the 2012 parameters, which turns 2012 into the baseline year. Annual CPI results from before 2012 cannot be compared to other years. The 13 different data sources used to calculate the CPI all measure various aspects of public sector. This ranges from bribery, the diversion of public funds, and the effective prosecution of corruption cases, to adequate legal frameworks, access to information, and legal protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators. The CPI does not measure activities such as tax fraud, money laundering, financial secrecy, or illicit flows of money. Corruption generally involves illegal activities which are deliberately hidden and only come to light through scandals, investigations, or prosecutions. Researchers, civil society, and governments have made advances in measuring corruption in specific sectors. However, to date, there is no index which directly measures real levels of corruption in all its manifestations. The data sources that make up the CPI ask business executives and country experts questions which are based on carefully designed questionnaires. The CPI scores generally correlate with certain objective measures, including citizens' reported experience with bribery. To ensure that the CPI methodology and results are reliable, the index is regularly reviewed by independent evaluators. Such reviews have consistently shown that the CPI is statistically and conceptually coherent. Ultimately, the CPI is the most widely used corruption measurement indicator due to the wide global coverage, the increased reliability which comes with combining different sources, and the fact that it reconciles different points of view on what constitutes public sector corruption. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/CPI.
Many of the world Once we have found people, then we can but what can we do? Just say
After now, we're coming back.
no.
After that, I is more than
Before that,
before that.
yes.
Who's the MC? What's the MC again? Oh, no, he's here. He's right behind me. I can how is
But I'm not.
so she just called and say something about what's that? About something.
It's quarter past 8.
Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and think tanks. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI. The CPI results are comparable across time back to 2012. This is because when we convert the original data to the CPI scale, we take into account the 2012 parameters, which turns 2012 into the baseline year. Annual CPI results from before 2012 cannot be compared to other years. The 13 different data sources used to calculate the CPI all measure various aspects of corruption in the public sector. This ranges from bribery, the diversion of public funds, and the effective prosecution of corruption cases, to adequate legal frameworks, access to information, and legal protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators. The CPI does not measure activities such as tax fraud, money laundering, financial secrecy, or illicit flows of money. Corruption generally involves illegal activities which are deliberately hidden and only come to light through scandals, investigations, or prosecutions. Researchers, civil society, and governments have made advances in measuring corruption in specific sectors. However, to date, there is no index which directly measures real levels of corruption in all its manifestations. The data sources that make up the CPI ask business executives and country experts questions which are based on carefully designed questionnaires. The CPI scores generally correlate with certain objective measures, including citizens' reported experience with bribery. To ensure that the CPI methodology and results are reliable, the index is regularly reviewed by independent evaluators. Such reviews have consistently shown that the CPI is statistically and conceptually coherent. Ultimately, the CPI is the most widely used corruption measurement indicator due to the wide global coverage, the increased reliability which comes with combining different sources, and the fact that it reconciles different points of view on what constitutes public sector corruption. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/. Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and think tanks. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI. The CPI results are comparable across time back to 2012. This is because when we convert the original data to the CPI scale, we take into account the 2012 parameters, which turns 2012 into the baseline year. Annual CPI results from before 2012 cannot be compared to other years. The 13 different data sources used to calculate the CPI all measure various aspects of corruption in the public sector. This ranges from bribery, the diversion of public funds, and the effective prosecution of corruption cases, to adequate legal frameworks, access to information, and legal protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators. The CPI does not measure activities such as tax fraud, money laundering, financial secrecy, or illicit flows of money. Corruption generally involves illegal activities which are deliberately hidden and only come to light through scandals, investigations, or prosecutions. Researchers, civil society, and governments have made advances in measuring corruption in specific sectors. However, to date, there is no index which directly measures real levels of corruption in all its manifestations. The data sources that make up the CPI ask business executives and country experts questions which are based on carefully designed questionnaires. The CPI scores generally correlate with certain objective measures, including citizens' reported experience with bribery. To ensure that the CPI methodology and results are reliable, the index is regularly reviewed by independent evaluators. Such reviews have consistently shown that the CPI is statistically and conceptually coherent. Ultimately, the CPI is the most widely used corruption measurement indicator due to the wide global coverage, the increased reliability which comes with combining different sources, and the fact that it reconciles different points of view on what constitutes public sector corruption. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/CPI. Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and think tanks. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI. The CPI results are comparable across time back to 2012. This is because when we convert the original data to the CPI scale, we take into account the 2012 parameters, which turns 2012 into the baseline year. Annual CPI results from before 2012 cannot be compared to other years. The 13 different data sources used to calculate the CPI all measure various aspects of corruption in the public sector. This ranges from bribery, the diversion of public funds, and the effective prosecution of corruption cases, to adequate legal frameworks, access to information, and legal protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators. The CPI does not measure activities such as tax fraud, money laundering, financial secrecy, or illicit flows of money. Corruption generally involves illegal activities which are deliberately hidden and only come to light through scandals, investigations, or prosecutions. Researchers, civil society, and governments have made advances in measuring corruption in specific sectors. However, to date, there is no index which directly measures real levels of corruption in all its manifestations. The data sources that make up the CPI ask business executives and country experts questions which are based on carefully designed questionnaires. The CPI scores generally correlate with certain objective measures, including citizens' reported experience with bribery. To ensure that the CPI methodology and results are reliable, the index is regularly reviewed by independent evaluators. Such reviews have consistently shown that the CPI is statistically and conceptually coherent. Ultimately, the CPI is the most widely used corruption measurement indicator due to the wide global coverage, the increased reliability which comes with combining different sources, and the fact that it reconciles different points of view on what constitutes public sector corruption. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/CPI. Such reviews have consistently shown that the CPI is statistically and conceptually coherent. Ultimately, the CPI is the most widely used corruption measurement indicator due to the wide global coverage, the increased reliability which comes from combining different sources, and the fact that it represents different points of view on what constitutes public sector corruption. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/CPI. The Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and fintechs. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the averages and transform scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI. The CPI results are comparable across time back to 20. Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and think tanks. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1. As a result, therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI. The CPI results are comparable across time back to 2012. This is because when we convert the original data to the CPI scale, we take into account the 2012 parameters, which turns 2012 into the baseline year. Annual CPI results from before 2012 cannot be compared to other years. The 13 different data sources used to calculate the CPI all measure various aspects of corruption in the public sector. This ranges from bribery, the diversion of public funds, and the effective prosecution of corruption cases, to adequate legal frameworks, access to information, and legal protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators. The CPI does not measure activities such as tax fraud, money laundering, financial secrecy, or illicit flows of money. Corruption generally involves illegal activities which are deliberately hidden and only come to light through scandals, investigations, or prosecutions. Researchers, civil society, and governments have made advances in measuring corruption in specific sectors. However, to date, there is no index which directly measures real levels of corruption in all its manifestations. The data sources that make up the CPI ask business executives and country experts questions which are based on carefully designed questionnaires. The CPI scores generally correlate with certain objective measures, including citizens' reported experience with bribery. To ensure that the CPI methodology and results are reliable, the index is regularly reviewed by independent evaluators. Such reviews have consistently shown that the CPI is statistically and conceptually coherent. Ultimately, the CPI is the most widely used corruption measurement indicator due to the wide global coverage, the increased reliability which comes with combining different sources, and the fact that it reconciles different points of view on what constitutes public sector corruption. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/CPI.
time, we need to commence our program in earnest. My name is Tommy Singongi from Transparency International Zambia, and I will be your master of ceremony this morning. I would like to recognize Mr. Kalungu Samba, our Transparency International Zambia chapter president, Mr. Tom Shamakamba, the Anti-Corruption Commission Director General. Also recognizing Councillor Mukubesa Nyoni, Kalinga Ward, representing Her Worship, the Mayor of Lusaka. Mr. Difat Tembo, representing Financial Intelligence Center, Director General. And also Mr. Bob Liebenthal from Partnership for Transparency Fund. With those salutations, I'd like to draw our attention to the program. Today's program is not quite extensive. We only expect to go up to mid-morning. And as you can see, we will move towards welcome remarks. We will then have two presentations, one on the global and regional highlights, and another one on Zambia's performance under the CPI. We will then have a speech on the 2022 CPI results from the law enforcement perspective, and this will be done by Mr. Tom Shamakamba, Director General from ACC. And then we'll have a panel discussion to look at stakeholder reactions to the report and results. And finally, we'll end with a speech from TIZ's chapter president, who will give key recommendations and also officially launch the report. Before we go any further, I would like to ask Mr. Patrick Waya to assist us and open with prayer.
Let us pray. We come before you, God our Father, to give you thanks, glory, and praise for the gift of this day and the gift of life. We want to thank you because you have made it possible for us to meet in this manner. Dear Lord, we pray that you bless us, you bless this meeting, and for the activities we are going to do, so that in whatever we are going to do, we will not depart from your will. We make our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waya, who seems to be our de facto TIZ's chaplain. At this point, I'd like to call Madam Tusokola, who is the Transparency International Zambia board member, to come and give welcome remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will be making the opening remarks on behalf of the TIZ Executive Director, Mr. Maurice Nyambe, who unfortunately just received bereavement. I'm sure a number of you saw him earlier on, but he's had to rush away. There's a bereavement in Chingola. It is my honor to welcome you all to the launch of the 2022 Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, whose theme is Corruption, Conflict, and Security. As many of you here will know, the CPI is a critical research that is done at global level and is currently the most widely used measure of public sector corruption across the globe. It goes without saying that measuring corruption is essential for the development of appropriate anti-corruption interventions, and for the Transparency International Zambia, the CPI, together with the Zambia Bribe Pairs Index Survey, is critical for both customizing our interventions and evaluating the progress made in the fighting this vice. Ladies and gentlemen, in the recent past, the fight against corruption has been said to have been waged against political lines, with some of the sections of society going as far as calling it a political witch hunt. Further, there are many stakeholders who believe that the fight against corruption under the UPND administration has been lacking coordination and a policy focus. Based on these concerns, there is great suspicion that the past 1 year has been more talk than action and more arrests than prosecutions, leading to the narrative that little to no progress has been made in the fighting corruption in the last period. Thankfully, we do not need to rely on political opinions, suppositions, or self-assessment when it comes to measuring corruption, the corruption fight. The CPI is an authoritative measure that is based on sound methodology. And in the case of Zambia, it is derived from 9 reputable data sources. The 2022 CPI results will therefore give us a good indication of the extent to which the current regime has made progress or not in fighting corruption. It will also show whether the concerted efforts among critical players in the anti-corruption fight, including TIZ and the Anti-Corruption Commission, have contributed positively to changing the corruption narrative. Therefore, as the results are unveiled, I call upon you all to reflect and on them as either correction or indeed affirmation with respect to the work we have done during the past year. As we draw our plans on scaling up the fight against corruption in 2023, we will do well to follow the evidence-based guidance generated from the 2022 CPI results that we are unveiling today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor and privilege, and on behalf of the TIZ board and the general membership, and indeed on behalf of the TIZ members of staff, to officially welcome you all to the launch of the 2022 Corruption Perception Index in Zambia. I thank you for your attention, and may God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Tusokola, for those warm welcome remarks. At this point in time, I'd like to draw your attention to the screens for the first presentation, which will look at the global and regional highlights for the CPI 2022 report. And I'll call upon Madam Tamika Harwindi, the TIZ's program coordinator, who will make this presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. All protocols observed. My name is Tahamudi with TIZ Secretariat, and my presentation that I'll be making will focus mostly on the global highlights of the 2022 Corruption Perceptions Index. So the global highlights are very important for this event before we actually delve into what is happening with regards to Zambia's CPI score for 2022. So when you look at the global highlights, the 2022 CPI, reveals that despite the concerted efforts that have been made and the gains, we cannot take progress against corruption for granted. The 2022 shows the scale of the problem and that the problem of corruption is enormous. Sorry, just bear with me. Just a minute, just trying to speak to the slides. Sorry, just bear with us as we try to get the slides back on. Okay, thank you, and thank you for your patience. Um, as I was saying, when you look at the global highlights, we see that the scale of the problem of corruption is enormous. The global average with regards to the CPI score has remained the same at a score of 43 out of 100, and this is for the 11th year running. We also see that more than 2/3 of countries, which is 122 countries, have serious corruption problems. And this is shown that more than 2/3 of countries, so 122 out of 180 countries, have scored below 50 when it comes to the 2022 CPI. As you know, the CPI scores on a range of 0 to 100, with 100 representing a high score and 0 being most corrupt. The 2022 global highlights also show that since 2017, only 8 countries out of 180 countries have significantly improved their CPI scores, while 26 countries on the global index have reached their lowest scores yet this year. Still on global highlights, when we look at who is topping the scores, so we have the top 11 country scores, 11 because as you will see, trailing the top 10 or top 11, there's Ireland and Luxembourg that are tied at 77. This year we see that Denmark is topping the CPI with a score of 90, followed by Finland and New Zealand that have a score of 87. In terms of who is trailing the CPI, the bottom countries, we see that the bottom countries are Somalia with a score of 12, Syria with a score of 13, and South Sudan with a score of 13. So all these countries, as you would know, are characterized by protracted conflicts, which is in line with this year's CPI theme: corruption, conflict, and security. So we also see that for the bottom 10 countries, most of them are characterized by years of violence, which has decimated resources and left them very vulnerable to corruption, which makes it very difficult for governments in those countries to make any progress with regards to the fight against corruption. Regional highlights. What are we seeing globally as the regions? Very interesting, you will note that we have very high scores in the region and very low scores, so there seems to be a widening gap with regards to the CPI. So when you look at Western Europe and the EU, topping that region is Denmark with 90, and the bottom performing country is Hungary with 42 out of 180. We go to the South East Asia Pacific. Their average regional score is 45. Topping the region is New Zealand with 87 out of 100. And trailing the region is North Korea at 17. So you can see how that has put down their average regional score. We then go over and look at what's happening in the Americas. In the Americas, their average regional score is 43. Topping the region is Canada with 74 and New Zealand with 14. Again, you can see that disparity between the scores for those countries in that region. Middle East and North Africa, topping the CPI in the region is the United Arab Emirates, and the bottom performer is Syria with a score of 13, UAE with a score of 67. Eastern Europe and Central Asia, their average score is 35 as a region. Top performing country is 56, that is Georgia, and bottom is Turkmenistan with 19 out of 100. Last but not least, maybe least, is Sub-Saharan Africa. Topping SSA is Seychelles, which has been a top performer when it comes to CPI at 70. And at the bottom of the list with regards to the regional score is Somalia with a score of 12. So again, you see the disparity with regards to the regional performance. So looking at what's happening in terms of the top performing region, which is Western Europe and the EU, with an average regional score of 66. We can see there that Denmark, like I said, and as the presentation has shown, is topping the chart at 90. And we can see that's followed by Finland, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and Netherlands. At the bottom of this region, we see Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. When we look at the worst performing regions, unfortunately, we see that our region, Sub-Saharan Africa, continues to perform poorly when it comes to the CPI. We have an average regional score of 32 out of 100, and we are trailing behind Eastern Europe and Central Asia with a score of 35. Interestingly, you will note that Eastern Europe and Central Asia are the regions where Russia and Ukraine are included with regards to the CPI score. So delving deeper into this CPI's theme, which is corruption, conflict, and security, what the 2022 CPI is showing us that shows us that corruption, conflict, and security are interrelated and intertwined. So we are seeing that corruption can be two things. It can be a cause of conflict, but it also is a result of conflict. And this forms a vicious circle which is very difficult for countries to break. For instance, if you look at our neighbor, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is historically known to be an unstable region, a region characterized by political conflict, and how corruption has thrived in that region because of the conflict. So we see that corruption and conflict feed off each other. Another example is Serbia, where the CPI shows that the judiciary is being heavily influenced by political players, so some form of political capture, which has undermined Serbia's progress with regards to organized crime. This slide just shows a correlation analysis with regards to corruption and resistance to organized crime. So the analysis shows that top performing countries, so countries with a high CPI score, have greater resistance to organized crime. And countries with a low CPI score, so the CPI score is the horizontal axis, the vertical axis is resistance to organized crime. So countries with a low score also have a low resistance when it comes to fighting organized crime. However, not everything is perfect at the top. When you look at the top performing countries in Europe, you will see that the fallout with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine exposed how complicit most of these countries are in terms of enabling corruption elsewhere. So you will also note that last year, in 2022, the EU Court of Justice made a controversial ruling with regards to beneficial ownership, and we've seen countries such as Germany, which had a score of 79 this year, Ireland with 77, and the Netherlands with 80 have currently suspended public access to company beneficial ownership registers. So that is a sort of regression when it comes to access to information. On top of that, Transparency International's Exporting Corruption 2022 assessment shows that countries such as Denmark, which is the top performer, have regressed with regards to their foreign bribery obligations. So which means whilst there might be seemingly less public sector corruption in that country, they could be exporting corruption to other countries and regions. And of course, there is trouble at the bottom as well. And we see this mostly with regards to insecurity in the region. So you will note that a number of countries in the SSA region have struggled with security challenges in the form of military coups, terror attacks, and increased crime. We see that the bottom 30 countries from SSA, which includes Central African Republic, DRC, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan, which are known as conflicted regions, have a low score on the CPI, and this it correlates with the Global Peace Index, which includes them as 5 of the 10 least peaceful countries globally, according to the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we see that the least peaceful countries in the SSA region are also bottom performers when it comes to the Corruption Perception Index in 2022. Corruption watch list, interesting to note for our region, South Africa has a score of 43, which is above the average regional score of 32. But as we know, South Africa has been plagued by public sector corruption, which seems to be a serious problem, and we have seen this with a series of corruption scandals that have involved and implicated former heads of states as well as the incumbent president. So given those global and regional highlights, these are the recommendations from Transparency International at a global level. So there is need to address the threat that corruption and illicit finance pose to peace and security, and this should be a core business of political leaders, as well as a focus for both foreign and domestic policy. Reinforce checks and balances and promote separation of powers, which will insulate against corruption control and ensure that no branch can consolidate authority. So it's very important that there is a separation of powers between the judicial, executive, and legislature. There is need to share and uphold the right to information so that the public knows where public expenditure is going and how resources are being distributed, and this will promote and engender trust in countries.
It's not charging.
Last slide of global recommendations. There is need to limit private influence by regulating, lobbying, and promoting open access to decision-making so that policies are determined by fair and public processes. So this speaks to that there should be efforts to ensure there is no private capture of decision-making and policy-making. And the final global recommendation is that combat of transnational forms of corruption by clamping down on corporate secrecy, foreign bribery, and complicit professional enablers. And we see this especially with the perpetrators being the top performance. There is more efforts that needs to go to transnational forms of corruption. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are the global highlights for the 2022 Corruption Perception Index. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madam Harwindi, for that presentation. We are now going to have a very important, brief footnote to that presentation, which is
the world's
global
most serious
video
problems.
played just now.
It also makes them worse. But most countries are not doing enough to stop it. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index ranks 180 countries and territories by their perceived levels of public sector corruption. It uses a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions. This year's results reveal an unchanging global average, with more than 2/3 of countries scoring below 50. And despite international commitments to fight it, only 25 countries have made significant progress in controlling corruption in the last decade. In the last 5 years, some countries have significantly declined in their CPI score, including rich economies like Austria, Canada, Luxembourg, and the United Kingdom, showing that even high-ranking countries need to keep their eyes wide open. We also witnessed how corruption has made the world a more dangerous place, posing a threat to national and international peace and security. Combined, these threats create a hostile environment where democracy is likely to backslide and authoritarian leaders get more powerful. Despite all this, citizens are raising their voices across the globe. In the last years, many of the biggest protests the world has seen were driven by the people's frustration about corruption in government, with many even risking their lives. Go to transparency.org/CPI to see how your country measures up and what you can do about it.
Is the fact that corruption remains a huge issue and problem to tackle, with the global average remaining at 43 for over a decade, 11 years now, and further highlighting the fact that 2/3 of countries are still performing below 50 out of 100 in the CPI index. She also highlighted some of the best performing countries, the first of which is Denmark with a score of 90. She also highlighted the worst performing countries, with Somalia with a score of 12. Incidentally, the lowest performing country coming from sub-Saharan Africa, out of which the highest performing country is Seychelles with a score of 70. She also spoke about the link between corruption and conflict, how those feed into each other and cause a vicious cycle, which exacerbates both of those vices. But she also highlighted some of the challenges both at the top and at the bottom of the CPI range. At the top, of course, countries that are performing well in the CPI also seem to have the challenge of enabling corruption elsewhere. And finally, the lowest performing countries seem to be those also grappling with internal conflict. Also, just to highlight that those with questions will have an opportunity to ask those questions after the panel discussion, which will be coming up very soon. At this point, I'd like to call upon Mr. Bright Chizonde, who will be giving us a presentation on Zambia's performance in the 2022 CPI. Mr. Chizonde.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. So far, I hope we are enjoying ourselves and we have followed in terms of the global results. So I'll briefly present the case of Zambia in terms of the performance in 2022. I will start off by going through briefly about the methodology of the CPI, because that will provide the context in terms of how the results for Zambia have come out. I think from the video we have been watching around CPI, we know what the CPI is, but briefly, this is the CPI scores 100 countries and territories around the world in terms of perceptions of public sector corruption. The score reflects the views of experts and surveys from business people and not the general public. I think those are very important to take note of. So in terms of the countries we are looking at, there are 100 countries. In terms of the scope of the CPI, it looks at public sector corruption. So it does not include private sector corruption or illicit financial flows. So that is very important to also take note. And then there's always the issue of expert perceptions, or why we use perceptions as opposed to experiential information. So the CPI uses perceptions, but it's important to note these are not perceptions of the general public, like just any ordinary individual on the ground being surveyed as part of the CPI. These are expert perceptions. Okay, go back. Okay, so the CPI is calculated using data from 13 external sources. That's globally, including the World Bank, World Economic Forum, private risk and consulting companies, think tanks, and others. So in terms of the data sources. So it's important to note, so I'll briefly explain how the CPI comes to be. So the first thing you will ask yourself is where the CPI comes from is the data sources. So globally, we have about 13 external different data sources for the CPI. These are reputable entities, like the World Bank, for example, who assess countries for different reasons. But within their assessments, we have particular corruption questions which they ask. So it is those corruption questions which then feed into the CPI measure. It is a weighted average of the standardized scores from the 13 different data sources containing specific governance and corruption questions. So for the case of Zambia, which I will also explain very soon, we use 9 different data sources. So what we do is to, once we get the score from the different 9 data sources, is to simply compute the average score, which is called the CPI. In terms of interpretation, the CPI uses a scale of 0 to 100. 100 means the country is clean. 0 means that the country is almost completely corrupt. So, and then it also ranks countries in terms of 1 to 180 countries. So explaining the difference between the CPI score and the rank. So let's give an example of a class setup when you are getting results for your child at school. So the child is going to score a grade in mathematics, a grade in English, a grade in science, and then so those are the individual data sources scores. Then you get the average of those scores, it's called the CPI. In terms of the rank, you are looking at where your child now stands in terms of the class. So it's number 1, number 2, number 3, so the rank is out of 180. Okay, it is now my pleasure to present the results for Zambia for the 2022 CPI. So as you can see, in terms of the trend for the Zambia, we've been moving from 38 in 2016, then we are at 37 in 2017, then 35 in 2018, in 2019 34, and then we maintained the score in 2020 at 33, 2021 at 33 as well, and also for the year 2022, the score has been maintained at 33. Just to give Zambia's position compared to the countries within the region and where we stand compared to some of the countries we know. Of course, you know Botswana has been performing very well on the CPI in the past. So you will see that in the 2022 CPI, Botswana increased its score from 55 to 60. Rwanda dropped from 53 to 51. Namibia maintained its score at 49. South Africa dropped from 44 to 43. Tanzania dropped from 39 to 38. And of course, Zambia maintains its score at 33. So if you compare with the other countries, we are not doing very well. So we would have done better in terms of us moving up. We have been using this comparison, I think, for the past 3 years, ranking Zambia against these selected countries, and Zambia has always been at the bottom. So remember what I explained in terms of the you getting the results for your child at school, in terms of the different data sources. So for the case of Zambia and the CPI in 2022, we have 9 different data sources for Zambia. And as you can see, only 2 of the data sources registered positive improvements. And these are the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey and the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. The rest of the data sources remained constant. So it's like your child has gotten grades. If you compare from last term, all the other subjects, they are the same. Only 2 subjects have improved, okay? So obviously, if you look at now the average has ended up being constant, maintained. However, I think it's also important to note, as I have already explained, that the CPI is an average of these data sources. If you look at the average in 2021, the CPI score was 32.5, okay? And the CPI is rounded off to the nearest whole number. So 32.5 led to the 33 that we have in 2021. So if you look at the average score for 2022 in the CPI, there's an improvement because of those 2 data sources which have improved. In the actual average CPI, it has improved to 33.4, which is a 0.9 point increase. However, because the point increase is not up to 1%, we cannot round off 33.4 to 34, right? So the score has been maintained at 33. So in the 2022 CPI, only the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey and the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index indicated improvements, while the rest of the indicators remained constant. So we have 2 important questions that we need to ask. What has informed the change? And by referring to the change, I'm referring to those 2 improvements. What have we improved in? And then we'll ask the second important question, what has led to the stagnation? So what has informed the change? We look at the data sources which have improved. So the first one is the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey. And the important corruption question in this particular survey, remember what I said again, is that within that particular data source, there are specific questions which are asked around corruption, which then guides you to know what kind of corruption has been reduced to lead to an improvement in the particular score. So in this particular survey, we have a question like, in your country, how common is it for firms to make undocumented extra payments of rights connected with the following: imports and exports, public utilities, annual tax payments, awards of public contracts and licenses, and obtaining favorable judicial decisions? That's the first question. Then the second question, in your country, how common is diversion of public funds to companies, individuals, or groups due to corruption? So we can make a conclusion based on the questions which were asked, because this particular data source registered an improvement. And then the second data source which registered an improvement is the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, with a 1 point improvement. The corruption question in this particular case is, to what extent do public or government officials in the executive, judiciary, police, and military legislature use public office for private gain? And then these are scored separately by experts, and thereafter the 4 sub-indicators are then averaged to create a single score for this particular data source. So we can make the change conclusions. I call them change conclusions, which are conclusions drawn from where the change has come from in terms of the data sources. So the results indicate that during the year 2022, there was a significant reduction in bribery activities between the private and public sector, and less funds were diverted to companies, individuals, and/or groups. Furthermore, there was also a reduction in the use of public offices for private gain across all the 3 arms of government. So that is what the improvement has been. As I mentioned, the improvement was not significant to 1 point, so the CPI score has remained constant despite that improvement. Let me now move on to the second important question, which is what has informed the stagnation. So obviously, we are stagnated at 33 because we have a number of data sources, which are 5 data sources, which have remained constant. So just to mention, I think in the previous table I had indicated with a star that 2 out of the 9 data sources for Zambia were not updated in 2022. These are the African Development Bank Country Policy and Institutional Assessment and the Bertelsmann Stiftag Transformation Index. So these were not updated, meaning that if you look at a 0 score, a 0 difference in the score, that just is attributed to the fact that the data source was not changed, it was not updated, so we don't have a new information, okay? So we cannot really say that is the reason for the stagnation. But 5 out of the 9 data sources were maintained and therefore contributed to the stagnated overall CPI score. What I mean by this is that 5 new assessments were done from the different data sources, and the results of those 5 was that the score is still the same, meaning we have not improved in those 5 different areas. So it's important, therefore, to assess the 5 data sources which have been maintained in order to identify what we need to improve on. So just a run through the 5 different data sources, and you're asking yourself the question, what kind of corruption are they focused on? So the first one is political corruption, embezzlement. That's the Varieties of Democracy Index. So we have transparency and accountability in the public financial management. We have excessive patronage, nepotism, and state capture due to political party and campaign financing. We have bribery to access contracts, secure imports, exports, and regulation approvals or licensing. That's from the Global Business Insight. And then we have accountability in the management of public funds, abuse of public funds, and public procurement corruption. That's from the Economist Intelligence data source. So in other words, if you look at these different types or forms of corruption, this is where we need to work on. This is where we have not registered any improvement in the year 2022, according to the CPI. So let me now make the stagnation conclusion. So the 2022 CPI has stagnated at 33 out of 100 due to limited government and stakeholder action to address public procurement corruption, bribery in the private sector, and state capture on account of business interests funding political parties and campaigns. The score has also stagnated due to limited transparency and accountability in the management of public funds and the abuse of public funds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chizonde, for that presentation on Zambia's performance on the 2022 CPI. A few highlights of his presentation. The first was on the methodology of the CPI. He mentioned that it is compiled of 180 countries, and of course its rank is from 1 to 180, and the scores also rank from 0 to 100, that it is a weighted average of about 13 external sources, and that it is comprised of expert opinion surveys and not from the general public. As for Zambia's performance, he mentioned that Zambia is still at 33 out of 100 for the third consecutive year. Of course, as we look into the detail, we find that there was some improvement of 0.9 from 32.5 in 2021 to 33.4 in 2022. He also made some comparison with other countries that we have been tracking over the past several years, such as Botswana, which is performing quite well and is at 60 in comparison to Zambia's 33, although we have had some minor improvement with the sub-Saharan African average, which is currently at 32. At this point, I would like to go into the next session, which will be the panel discussion. And this session is being moderated by Mr. Chimuka Nachilinga. It is going to look at the stakeholder perspectives on the report and some quick reactions, after which we're also going to be able to have some questions and answers. Mr. Nachilinga. Apologies, we seem to be moving too quick for the program. We currently have a speech, which is the law enforcement perspective of this report, which has just been announced, which is going to be done by Mr. Tom Shamakamba, the Director General for Anti-Corruption Commission. We kindly invite you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. As stated, my name is Tom Shamakamba, the Director General of ACC. May I simply say protocol or protocol observed. I'm delighted to be part of the launch of the 2022 Transparent International Corruption Perception Index for the year 2022. However, the Commission notes with concern the score of 33 points for Zambia in this survey, and that it has maintained the score for the third consecutive year. This score indicates that the state of corruption in Zambia has not deteriorated from the previous years. It means avenues or opportunities of corruption are slowly being contained as the score is not getting worse. This is an indication that anti-corruption strategies that have been put in place in the last few years are somewhat working. However, we need to do better, and we are determined to turn around things and make corruption a very high-risk crime. I'm aware, ladies and gentlemen, that there have been press pronouncements from some sectors of our society that the anti-corruption have engaged the Americans to do ACC work. Please let me inform this gathering that to widen our network to fight corruption in the world, anti-corruption is engaging other anti-corruption bodies in other jurisdictions. It is a well-known fact that people who involve themselves in corruption in this country hide money in other jurisdictions. And therefore, it has become necessary to engage other stakeholders. Similarly, within our borders, we have engaged other stakeholders whom we are working together to fight the scourge of corruption. So if you think you hide your money outside the country when you steal from Zambia, please, this is a warning. The Commission is now more geared than ever to hold the bull by its horns and address the corruption challenges head on. The Commission is determined to bring to book any person that may have committed any corruption offense now or before and prosecute them. It will not matter on the social standing of the suspects, whether current or past senior government officials or political affiliation. Anybody that will be found wanting will be arrested and taken to court. Yes, again, there have been talk that the anti-corruption is targeting those from the previous government. I can tell this gathering that there is a lot of millions of dollars that have gone under the previous government, which we're investigating. And similarly, we have written a recommendation to supervisors in various ministries requesting to suspend some current heads of institutions because we have charged them with corruption. So the issue of saying anti-corruption is only kneeling on the previous corruption, please, that is a myth. Even in the current government, we have people we have charged, and soon you'll be seeing them appearing before courts of law. The Commission notes with interest calls for lifestyle audits, especially for public officers. In order to make these audits practical, we need to strengthen the laws that govern declaration of assets for public persons that are appointed into public and state offices so that there is transparency and accountability in the lifestyles of such individuals. In Zambia, currently when you are employed in the public service, you only do a form where you declare your assets. Thereafter, what matters, and when you leave office, there is nothing that is done. So we are proposing that if you join the public service, there should be a law which will be monitoring from day one to the day you leave public office. It will be monitoring how many assets you have acquired. And that law will extend to your wife and your children. Because we have seen a trend that public officers, when they steal money or they acquire a lot of assets, they hide in the name of their wives, their children. So there will be a requirement that whenever you join the public service, you must declare your assets, and while you are working, you must be doing further declarations. So even when you leave public office, you should declare what you have acquired. And there will be a requirement for ACC. If you declare, we investigate those properties. So those are part of the reforms that are coming. Further, procurement regulations need to be strengthened, as we all know that much of the leakage of public resources in the procurement of goods and services. It is for this reason that the Commission has ensured that it sits on all procurement meetings, including those that relate to constituency development funds. It is now a trend in all public institutions that whenever there are procurements, an ACC officer must sit on those committees. And we are now even cancelling certain tenders where we see that tender procedures have not been followed. Further, I think you have heard from the media that the Constituency Development Act will be amended to make it mandatory for ACC officers to sit on those committees. Further, I also wish to inform you that in all government ministries, it is a requirement that when you are employing officers, ACC should sit on those committees that are employing, and also all ministries are supposed to have what we call integrity committees. The main issue with those integrity committees is to ensure that certain risks that invite corruption should be removed. And the integrity committees are supposed to furnish reports to ACC. And I'm glad to inform this gathering that actually the Secretary to the Cabinet has taken on all heads of institutions in the government that are not following that directive. And wherever these integrity committees are, those that have been doing well, the risk of corruption is basically zero. So with those, I would like to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shamakamba, for some very interesting revelations. I think speaking to improvements or strengthening of our legal framework and other areas that government is working towards. I think one which was prominent was looking at the legislation which looks at declaration of assets, which he said would also extend to wives and children. I think is a very interesting and important aspect. He also talked about improving procurement regulation, and also talked about the ACC's presence in employment procedures, and further the importance and now the mandate around integrity committees in all government ministries. At this point, we'll move to the stakeholder perspective, which will be moderated by Mr. Chimuka Nachminga.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, Director of Programs. At this particular point in time, we are going to proceed, like Tommy has indicated, to have some form of a plenary, but we are going to have it in a different way. When you look at the program, I'm sure the stakeholders that are supposed to come in front are indicated, but we are not going to go in that way. The answers are within ourselves, and the questions are within ourselves. I want to believe that whoever has come here has got an answer to one of the questions that is going to be asked, and whoever has come here has got an answer to the question that is going to be asked by somebody. So we won't have a panel in front of us. But in case there will be a question that will require a specific stakeholder, it could be TIZ, it could be ACC, or it could be any operating partner that is here, please feel free to direct that question to that respective institution. So without wasting much of the time, I will open this session. The presentations have been made, and I don't want to go back again to highlight the findings of the Corruption Perception Index, the global and the Zambian context, but I'll just take this opportunity to open it up for reactions. It could be a question, it could be a comment, it could be a recommendation. Please feel free to make mention of those. So the floor is open. Who is taking up first? Okay, I see a hand here. You.
Thank you so much, moderator. My question goes to Mr. Tom Shamakamba. thank you for the speech. I think the speech that you have given gives us hope and courage that we will see corruption being fought in the near future. However, looking at the CPI results and the study for Zambia, we have remained at 33. Just as in football, if we keep on defending and we are not scoring, I think there is a danger that somewhere maybe the other teams are scoring and eventually we may be voted out. Now, what strategies do you think you'll be able to put in place so that maybe next year the picture can change from being at the same position, maybe to move to another position? Because we may not know that by being at the same position and continuing to defend, to be at the same position, maybe those that are involved in corruption are also developing some camouflages that they shouldn't be caught. And that's why maybe we are just defending and being put at the same level without scoring, so that they can continue enjoying whatever they do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daka. We will take 3 questions and then we will allow the stakeholders to respond.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elvis Choboka from Civil Society for Poverty Reduction. My question is directed to anyone from the Financial Intelligence Center. I was just looking at the 2021 suspicions trends reports, which has reported that there was about 3.6 billion, which was lost to basic financial flows. And it increased actually in 2021 to about 4.3 billion. So I just wanted to find out what measures are being put in place to curb illicit financial flows. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There was a hand here.
Good morning. My name is Venice Yumba. I'm the chairperson of the Integrity Committee from the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission. My question is to ACCDP, or is it a comment maybe? I think he mentioned that the reforms which are remarkable in terms of ensuring that our assets are declared. But there is one thing that they did mention about when you are interviewing and there's procurement at every level at CDF. So I was thinking that is it possible, is it practical that you have the kind of staff that can sit in all these committees? So my suggestion was that would it be okay that you have the integrity committee member maybe sit on those committees that are looking at employment or CDF? So that's my suggestion or my comment.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have 3 questions. We will allow the respective stakeholders to respond. Just to repeat the question. The question from Mr. Daka is on the fact that for the past 3 years, we are at 33. We are not improving. And if we can learn from Botswana, it's improved from 55 to 60. What can we learn from them? What strategies can we be able to put in place so that come 2020, come next year, the picture is changed? Then the other question from CSPR is specifically to FIC. Do we have FIC in our midst? Okay, anyone can pick this one. They are lamenting that there are a lot of the transactions, illicit financial transactions, are alarming in this country. So what strategies can we put in place to be able to curb this? Then the last question came from Consumer Protection Unit Commission, okay, and they are asking ACC to say your establishment, is it solid enough that you can be able to have all the that you can sit on all the committees. It could be procurement and other related committees, employment inclusive. So we will allow ACC to take up these two questions, and then anybody who has got an answer on what can be done as far as illicit financial flows are concerned will pick up this question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll start with a question. I'll also volunteer the question posed by the gentleman who asked about the Financial Intelligence Center. Basically, what the Financial Intelligence Center does is whenever there is some suspicious transaction, they will alert either DEC or ACC or any other law enforcement agency. And now it is up to that agency that has been alerted to move in. So for example, where ACC has been alerted, we have moved in actually to freeze that account. And there are a number of accounts in this country that have been frozen. And that is one area where the public does not even comment. We have actually millions of dollars that are lying in various bank accounts, which we are holding, and they are under investigations. That is what we normally do. And once we conclude investigation, we normally advertise for in the government gazette and the newspapers for people to come forward and claim that money. And if it is not claimed, that money goes to the state. Then further, in the same vein, there are people who are being prosecuted over certain suspicious money transactions. So I hope I've answered that question. Sorry? Thank you. What I'm saying, with the Financial Intelligence Center, what they do is, if there is a suspicious transaction in any bank, they will alert the law enforcement agencies that, look, there is this transaction, can you check? So if it is ACC that is alerted, we'll move in. And once we check, we'll write to the bank to restrict any transaction on that account. And as I said earlier on, there's a lot of money actually that we have restricted in various banks belonging to a lot of individuals. And that is why people are saying SEC is just looking at former leaders in the previous government. Yes, a lot of money has been moving from the guys who are running the show. So that fact you can't run away. A lot of money has been moving by the previous leaders in the government. People have been paid to say they supplied so and so to this ministry. Then we are alerted to say, no, there's this money that has moved from Ministry of Finance. Can you check on it? And we follow it, you find people haven't even supplied. And we have blocked a lot of money, huge. And I think sometimes people are criticizing ACC for being a toothless bull. I've always been saying, please approach us so that we tell you what we are doing. There are a number of brand new vehicles, not those 30 or so which were advertised and given away. No. Even as at now, we have a number of vehicles, trucks, buildings, farms which we have given to Zambia National Service, the prisons, with modern technology, which you people are not aware. We have seized big assets in millions of dollars, which Zambia National Service is running, which other, the Zambia Correction Service,
They have modern farms as a result of ACC. But people are criticizing ACC like it's not doing anything. I know the expectation of people is that no, ACC, they should investigate and prosecute and jail people. There are certain instances where people just abandon properties. They run away. What do? You keep chasing them? For how long? So what we are doing is, if we can't follow those people, all what we are doing is advertise those properties, and if the owners don't claim them, they'll be given to the state. And the rightful institutions who can run like farms, they are given those farms to run. Is that clear now, sir? Oh. Then the issue of the strategies that are being done. I think I mentioned of the joint efforts that we are doing with other local law enforcement agencies, together with the international anti-corruption agencies in other countries. It's a fact that people in the previous regime, what they were doing is, if there is a procurement, they will pay an entity, say in Australia, purporting they are buying some item on behalf of the government. That money will come back to them in certain accounts here in Zambia. And they'll start distributing that money to whoever beneficiaries they want to give. So due to certain collaborations with these foreign entities, they have alerted us to say, look, these monies have come into this account and they are now distributing them to these people. Be on the watch. So we have gone to an extent of even blocking those funds again. And all this is with the effort of FIC. And apart from that, there are also other cooperative partners who have come with information actually to say, look, these funds you are looking for, this is where they are keeping them. Mind you, it's not easy. It takes a long time to do investigations. Because as you said, the corrupt are powerful. Why are they powerful? They have money. They are sophisticated. They are able to pay people along their way to get away with these crimes. And this is why we have said, let's engage our partners who are also anti-corruption agencies in other countries. And even those other anti-corruption agencies in other countries, we are also learning what they are doing. What has made them to be where they are, as we have been taught by Transparency International. We are learning from them. And I also want to say this to the audience. You people, sometimes you have information, what other people are doing, but you don't want to report to us. You know your neighbor was just with a Corolla and he was not working. But all of a sudden, that is what is happening, my sister. All of a sudden, the guy has got 100 houses, 50 vehicles, and you're just sitting. And you expect anti-corruption to be a witch finder, knocking on the doors. Please assist us to fight corruption. We cannot do it alone. So even that, you reporting to anti-corruption is part of a strategy. You know your boss is getting certain allowances he's not supposed to get. You're just sitting there. Why not report to anti-corruption to say, DG, my boss, he has employed people who are not even working, but the salaries are going to these people's accounts and somebody is drawing them. Why not give us that information? People are busy sharing certain properties in this country. You have information, but you are not doing anything. You go to a roadblock, you pay a police officer to get away with your defective cars, instead of going to a shop and buy brand new tires so that tomorrow you don't corrupt a police officer. All those are things that you the audience, are supposed to refrain from. And I've been saying this, that because the public is crying that anti-corruption is not doing anything, we have a number of investigations towards certain individuals. For example, a person may be we may be carrying an investigation with one particular individual, say he has maybe 200 allegations. Now the question is, when are we going to finish all those 200 allegations against that person? So there's been a shift in policy to say, instead of waiting until we finish those 200 allegations, if we have even done one, let's take that person to court where we have evidence. So that if that person is convicted, we don't mind. He's going to be coming from jail, even appearing for other cases. Because we have seen that there's an outcry from the public to say anti-corruption is doing nothing. You arresting people up to now, no one is being taken to court. Yes, it's true. It is not easy to investigate. It takes time. So the only way we can come in is to say, okay, we have investigated the 5 allegations. We have sufficient evidence. Let's upload this. You will be appearing in court. And I can assure you, end of February, approach me and you will see what will be happening. We have a number of those. So end of February, I can assure you, I've even seen some people making noise when they are part of those investigations which are going on. We'll see what noise they will make. There are also other strategies that we have put in place, and I think what I can do as of now, let me hand over the mic to my director, who actually deals with corruption prevention, so that she can tell you what else we are doing in terms of other strategies.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Glenda Mungalaba, Director of Corruption Prevention. So other strategies, actually the DG has touched on some of them. He talked about the directive by Secretary to Cabinet for all institutions to have integrity committees. And that one is a serious directive, and I've seen that a lot of government institutions have taken it seriously and are requesting for training for their integrity committees. And the good news also is that we have an integrity committee even at the topmost office of the line, that is at State House. We had an inception meeting with them. They have established an integrity committee there. And also next week we'll be having a meeting at the Vice President's office to also have an integrity committee established there. Why am I mentioning this? Leading by example. We all know that what we lack most in these public institutions is leaders who can lead by example, who can show integrity and ethical behavior by doing it themselves. Now we have a situation where at the topmost office we have an IC, and we believe this is going to cascade down to all institutions because the expectation will be very high. The expectation for integrity committees to perform is very high. Then I also want to mention that we have intensified on synergizing with other organizations. Like there are certain public institutions which, in the eyes of the public, are very corrupt, and maybe as a result of the high levels of interaction they have with members of the public, or the volume of funds that they handle. I'm talking of institutions like Ministry of Health, institutions like Zambia Police. This year we are having programs with these organizations. Let me include the Ministry of Mines as well, because a lot of money is lost through undervalued minerals that are exported out of the country. So we have specifically targeted these institutions. We are working together with them to draw up programs of how we are going to enhance transparency, accountability, the way they conduct their programs. Right now we are conducting a corruption vulnerability assessment with the Ministry of Health. We started last week. We've talked to the stakeholders, external stakeholders, internal stakeholders, and we've been having workshops with them. And the hope is that at the end of it, we will come up with the resolutions or recommendations to streamline some of the processes that go on in the ministry, to identify the weak areas in those ministries. You might have heard us launch the No Bribes but Fines campaign last year for the Zambia police. That is also another program that we have embarked on, and we intend to intensify. It didn't end at the launch. We have other activities that we have planned, and we are working together with the Integrity Committee within the Zambia Police Service to make sure that we conduct various programs to monitor how the traffic corruption is taking place in roadblocks, traffic checkpoints. Some traffic checkpoints have even been removed as of now, which we thought are not relevant, as people have, there was a public outcry, and more will be coming, and you will see. Then we have also engaged the private sector. We launched the private sector symposium last year, and we intend to also penetrate the private sector because there's been an outcry that there's less anti-corruption effort that is seen in the private sector. But we were happy that in that symposium, there was a lot of interest that was shown from the private sector organizations, and they are willing to work with government, to partner with government. We have submitted the report to Cabinet Office, and we are yet to see what the comments from government would be. But we are continuing with these engagements with all the relevant stakeholders that we feel have got an important role to play in fighting corruption. We are also currently, right now, working with the media. I think our Director for Public Education has been around the country working, sensitizing the media to see how media can work with Anti-Corruption Commission in disseminating correct information about corruption, in exposing corruption, because through their investigative journalism, the media can also play a very important role in bringing out the issues, the corruption that is going on in the public, in the public institutions, and even in the private sector. Thank you.
Let me just also mention something. I don't know whether the audience heard what was on the news yesterday relating to Zambia public procurement agents, where the agents have actually banned 3 companies for life. They will never participate in any procurement. I don't know whether the audience heard that yesterday. And as an agent, we are not waiting for anybody to report. We are moving, and what are the strategies?
There was a question. I think a question. Yes.
Yes, there was a question on whether we have sufficient manpower to sit on various committees. My response, first of all, is that your request for the members of the Integrity Committee to sit on various committees is welcome, and we will look into it. But if all organizations are able to plan well in advance, we are able to sit. Because first of all, we have a presence in the 9 provinces, except Muchinga province, actually, where we are just trying to move in now. We have even selected the 7 officers to go into Muchinga province. But we'll get in touch and see how we can cooperate, because those are the areas I'm talking of collaboration. Because you are the eyes in these various parastatals or government institutions, and we hold you in high respect because of the various activities that you do on behalf of ACC, and we are very, very grateful for that. So we'll see how we can work together. All right.
Thank you so much, ACC, for the insights on the strategies that are being put. strategies that are being implemented in the fight against corruption. So I've seen 3 hands. Let me start with Action 8. I think they were the first. So due to time, I think we can be summarizing our questions and our responses as well.
Thank you so much, so much. I have 2 quick questions, but I'll base my questions on the diagnostic report on governance and corruption in Zambia, the report that was published last year, I think with the support of the cooperative partners. There were 2 issues, and I wanted to appreciate what efforts have been made to address the issues. Firstly, there was the issue to do with corruption investigation and prosecutions. And the report highlighted that while we see that there has been increase in terms of maybe investigations, but that has not translated, but that has not come out of as a result of an adequate, clear-based prioritization. So the report here was showing to say, while there has been an increase in investigations, but there appears to be a lack of adequate, clear, risk-based prioritization in terms of, for instance, prioritizing the type of cases to go for, and also looking at the issues of statistics. So I just wanted to appreciate what efforts have been done around that area. Then lastly, the other thing was to do with effectiveness of investigations, prosecution and corruption. And the report highlighted to say that while the SDC has power to conduct investigations, but the approval, they have to seek approval from the Director of Public Prosecution, and the DPP can either terminate through a NOLE or take over cases from the SCCA. So I just wanted to appreciate perhaps what efforts have been made to address some of these concerns that came from the report. Thank you.
Thank you. I will go to AAAZ.
Thank you so much. My name is Jeffrey Chip from AAAZ, Alliance for Accountability Advocate Zambia. I'm the Executive Director. I want to first appreciate the presentation, especially on the aspect of what Zambia is still challenged with in addressing the issues of corruption. I think the 5 areas of stagnation are very critical to look at, and even as we prioritize activities, it's very necessary to ensure that these are addressed, especially when we look at issues of political corruption, which I think anti-corruption has spoken to in terms of some of the strategies that they're trying to put in place. But I think we also need really to look at issues of accountability mechanisms that should be put in place. You earlier talked about taking integrity to the lowest level with issues of CDF coming into play, where we're looking at resources going at the community level, knowing that such structures have very little, if not no measures in terms of corruption reduction at that level, because the committees and structures that are put in place, some of them, of course, are not tied to any contractual obligation. They are loose structures. And some of the practices that you find in the community are very corrupt, highly corrupt practices. For example, I was just witnessing the selection criteria or looking at the applications. And you find people going in such structures with a list of who they would want to be, given the contracts, who have not applied. And of course, we have indicated to such structures to follow the right procedures, and where it is necessary, we definitely inform ACC to come into play. But I think one aspect that I would want to bring on board is even as you bring in these very important things on how we're going to address corruption in this country, there is need to emphasize and put more effort in ensuring that the citizens are fully involved. And by this, what I mean is we need to begin to even come up with very simple strategies like appointing community ACC champions professionals. These are just community members that are, we've trained, we've built capacity, and they are going to the community to talk about issues of corruption, because we know that corruption does not just happen. Yes, at political level, we know those big issues we're talking about, international monetary transfers and all that. But at community level, there is always this person who is enticed to pay to get a service. And this is why I think we need also to put in efforts and bring in issues of corruption mechanism at that level. So I thought we could also begin to look into those aspects. And of course, partner with different civil society organizations that are helping your organization to ensure that the issues of corruption are kept out in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AAZ, for those strategies that you have highlighted. I'll take that as not a question, but as a comment. There is a hand here.
My name is Mangaila. I read for Zambia before. I'm a journalist. The report itself has highlighted the causes of corruption, which has led Zambia to maintain the trade for 3 consecutive periods. My question to the SEC and other stakeholders is, what measures do we have, or are we putting in place to ensure that these problems which have led Zambia to maintain the trade position in the trade are curtailed? And what other measures are we putting in place to ensure that Zambia migrate from the trade
Thank you so much, Mike. What time did you come? A long time. I think your questions have been answered already. So I'll give another opportunity to somebody else to ask different questions. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. I'll allow the ACC to respond to 2 questions. I think the first one was on the diagnostic report. I think that is by the IMF. I think there are a lot of corruption-related aspects that came out in that report. So Action Aid would want to hear your reaction in terms of one, how are you prioritizing the list of cases, for example? Then secondly, how are you coordinating with the Director of Public Prosecution to ensure that the cases are quickly disposed? Thank you.
Maybe I'll start with the issue of the Director of Public Prosecution. You are aware that Mr. Gilbert Piri, who is now the DPP, who is the former Director General of ACC, and most of the cases that are there is the one who was working with those cases. And I can vouch as at now that he has literally given consent to prosecute most of these cases. Even yesterday when I was in the office, I received about 5 files where he has already given consent to prosecute. So most of the cases that have been investigated under Mr. Gilbert Piri, consent to prosecute he has granted. And that is why I will say, watch the space February. That is why I was saying, watch the space February. He has already given consent. So we have no problem with the Director of Prosecution to give consent. No, we have no problem. We are working well. The relationship is fantastic. So we have no problem. Then how we are working on the various cases, we have 3 teams of investigations under ACC. There is one team which is dedicated to high-profile cases. High-profile cases. Those involve politically connected people and huge, huge sums of money. And those are our priority. I think that is the area I wanted to get information. Yes, we have A, B, C. So there is a team of investigators which is led by an assistant director. And we normally have meetings, myself, the director of investigation, the assistant director, and these investigators. So we normally have meetings almost maybe 3-4 times in a week, because we want these cases to move fast. Because we are aware of what the public is talking about. So we are on top of things. Then I think the other issue was a compliment. Please, we take note of that compliment. We shall see how we can actually form committees within the communities. But as it was indicated by the director, the public education department is actually sensitizing people on the ground on the effects of corruption, how they can work, how they can report to the various law enforcement agencies. So what we just need to do is perhaps form some sort of watchdogs. Yes. Then I'm also alert, have been cries that people have even been saying that, look, sorry to say this, we have received complaints that some of the MPs, the councillors who sit, I'm not saying it's your honorable, we have received reports that some of the MPs, the councillors, are favoring their own in the allocation of CDF, yes. So why don't you consider removing the MP so that he's not the one who is chairing this councillor? They should just be ordinary people within the community. So we are also looking at those to make recommendations. Because as you are aware, there was an initiative that the CDF Act should be amended. So those are the proposals that we wish to present so that we can see how things can be done in a better way.
Thank you, Director General. Any other question? I see a hand there.
Thank you very much. My name is Agatha Chipende from the Judiciary. My question points to the presentation from Tizonde on Zambia's performance, and that's at national level. My question borders on how we rate the performance of various organizations or institutions within the country. As we look at corruption perception, it was clear from the presentation that when measuring the CPR, they look at expert perception. Now, I'm trying to point to the fact that I understand various institutions suffer general perception as regards corruption, depending on the manner in which they operate. How do we rate these institutions? How do we separate that general perception, which is a combination of all sorts of things, lack of information, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding procedures, from expert perception itself? So to summarize my question, I'm trying to fish out expert perception from the full basket of ideas from the general public. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Any other question? I also want to ask a question, ask that permitted. Amongst the issues that have been highlighted regarding what's making Zambia to be stagnant on 33 is the issue of political party and campaign financing, the aspects. So we have seen that there's a lot of money that comes in the country, and this money to some extent is not accounted for. I think even DG has just mentioned to say that they are dealing with a case relating to PEPs, politically exposed people. And Of course, money is important for political parties to be able to function, but at the same time, too much money is dangerous for our democracy. So I wanted to hear a comment from ACC in terms of what could be the best way to regulate political party and campaign financing in our country, as we have seen that, of course, this is affecting our democracy in terms of trying to level the playing field. Those political parties that have got money are the ones that are competing, and also the electorates have a tendency of looking at who can dip deeper in their pocket for them to be able to choose. You go to members of parliament, they will tell you that as it stands right now, somebody requires about 1.5 million for them to be able to pursue a seat. So, what can we do about this situation in our country? Because if it's left as it is, we risk auctioning our country to the would-be terrorists or any other criminals. Thank you. Is there any other question? I see no question, so we only have 2 questions for SCC to comment on, and then we will move to the next session. Thank you.
I think the issue of political funding, we need to put an act in place which should regulate political funding. And there must be a limit on how much funding must be. And there must be declaration of the source where that money is coming from. Because if you are going to just receive money from anywhere, tomorrow you even receive money from the Taliban. So there must be declaration of source of funding, and equally there must be a limit. Because again, if you have too much money, as the MC is saying, you can destabilize the economy, you can destabilize the security of the country. And normally, you know, politics with money is very dynamic. People can buy their way in. So I think the major issue is we need a law that should regulate political funding. Thank you.
Just to add to what the Director General is saying on the issue of political party funding as well as campaign financing. Here in Zambia, since the time of President Mwanawasa up to today, this is an area where you see political parties agreeing on one thing. They grow very slowly. When you mention the word declaration of anything, the current government, the previous government, they want to smile to bring about the law. Director General, you need to do a lot of canvassing for that law to come into effect, because our parliament is very agreeable most of the times to preventing such a law to come into effect for various reasons. So this is a big fact, and we know it, that when monies come, the people receive the money. When they are in power, they tend to favor those that gave them money. And this has continued for a long time. So for this and such a campaign, it should not only remain with the Anti-Corruption Commission, Transparency International Zambia, but we should actually rally the Zambians to push our political parties, all political parties. Like I'm saying, they have an interest in this. They are so reluctant to bring up this law. If you were to test it in among our parliamentarians, how many of those are going to agree? But as we know also, parliamentarians on their own, they might not decide what they want to do unless their leaders of the political parties decide what to do. So this is an uphill battle, Director General, bringing about such a law in Zambia.
Thank you so much, Simi. Before I move to break, I'll give this opportunity to our councillor who is here to make mention of something about CDF. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mugore Sanyon, the councillor of Kalingari, also representing the mayor. I would like to congratulate the director for anti-corruption for the steps they are taking in order to curb corruption. I would like also to correct what the director just said. The MP does not chair the CDF committee. There's an independent person who chairs that committee. So I thought I should correct that. And also, the CDF committee constitutes of 3 councillors. 1 is appointed by the MP, and 2 are voted by the committee. I'm saying this to stress that CDF is here to help the people. So at any juncture where there's information that can be taken otherwise, as leaders, we have to correct it right there and then. Because people would use it as an excuse to say, I won't go there since I belong to that party. So I thought I could say that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'll give this opportunity to Mr. Chizonde. I think you heard your question. The lady from Judiciary wants to know if we take these institutions individually or if these perceptions are done generally, or we have to separate so that we can be able to know, for example, what's the performance of the judiciary itself.
Okay. So I think as we mentioned on the corruption perception index, we are using expert perception, right? And the expert perceptions are based on specific questions. Some questions, as I explained, would run across all the different arms of government. Some questions are more specific in terms of maybe focused on the police. So that's with respect to expert perceptions. But what we use to measure the actual experiential levels of corruption is a survey that we do every after 2 years, which is the Zambia Bribe Payers Index Survey, which goes to the grassroots in terms of at household level to get the experience of the households in terms of experience with corruption. If they went to a particular entity, to the health facility or to the courts, if they paid the bribe, and what was the impact of them paying the bribe, whether they received the service or they were limited because they refused to pay the bribe. So in terms of experiential kind of corruption, we do that at household level in terms of the household survey. It's the same approach which is used even at global level. The CPI is meant to give you trends in terms of corruption levels globally. So we need to include all the countries, so the 180 countries which are surveyed. But if you want to be more, in terms of more detail, you cannot do that for all the countries, all the 180 countries. So what Transparency International does, we select regions after the CPI is conducted. We select a particular region where we want to do now a deeper analysis, and then we compare how that analysis would reflect with the CPI, whether there are any differences. So, and when it comes to public perception, so all of these studies are not measuring public perception. Public perception runs in the media, it runs in social media, so that's public perception about. So public perception may be different, it may be about the way a specific institution manages its communication, and that may be where the public perception is coming from. Our studies look at expert perception and experiential, actual household level experience of corruption.
Thank you so much. I would encourage the participants or stakeholders to look out for the 2022 Bribe Payers Index. I'm sure the report will be launched soon as well, so that we can be able to know how the individual institutions that were assessed have performed for the year 2022, and we can be able to then marry it with the Corruption Perception Index. At this particular point in time, I will hand over to the Director of Programs. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nachivinga, for your moderation. that, I think, highly interactive session. And now we'll be coming to the CPI 2022 Key Recommendations speech, which will be done by Mr. Kalum Sampa, who is the TIZ chapter president, and he shall also lead us to the launch of the 2022 CPI study report. Mr. Kalum Sampa.
Thank you very much, Director of Programs. Before I go to my speech, let me also just make one or two comments on the questions that were going round through the just past session. I was very much impressed when Director General mentioned that they need to consult necessary institutions in and outside Zambia in order to fight corruption. For us, we are happy. Director General, whatever it takes to bring culprits of corruption within Zambia, outside, please go and get the necessary help you need so that these people can get the results for their actions. I also liked one part you mentioned, Director General, on issues of law reforms. And for us, we think one of the strategy which you should have, which we keep saying maybe has not come out quite clearly from SEC, is around issues of law reforms. You mentioned, Director General, that you actually invited people to come forth and report cases of corruption. But at the same time, our law itself puts the reporter at the mercy of the whip. It actually says, in case the case is fraudulent or it's false, the whistleblower can be prosecuted. We can learn from the British. The British say, if you are working for them or you are touching any money, you need to report a case. Even when it's a rumor, it's not your business to tell whether it's a rumor or fact, because you are not an investigator. You are just a citizen. You hear anything, bring the thing. We will have experts who will deal with that. I hope we can have such a law as well, where we tell everybody, Zambia, don't worry about the fact. We have the experts, SEC, to deal with whether it's true or not. But we tell the whistleblower, bring the case. But in case it's false, you'll be jailed. How many of us are going to report? Very few. But also, like you're saying, Director General, the law actually prohibits a lot of work you do. For instance, there is a clear definition between a public and state officer. And the Anti-Corruption Act talks about one, leaves the other. So others can commit corruption acts, but under the Anti-Corruption Act, they cannot be prosecuted because they have been redefined otherwise. So I'm happy that you're mentioning that one of your focus is to do law reforms. But also, I was intrigued also by the discussion on the excuse me, declaration of assets for the civil servants. And we should follow suit, like it says, annual declaration of assets by public senior officers. Although we have seen the declaration of assets also is a big issue, even when the law is there, people don't want to bring it open. We wish they can bring their declaration much more open so that even our CPI, if people are investigating taking cases on CPI, they can say that Zambia is an open and willing nation which provides information, especially to those that are handling public resources. The other part was cancelling of tenders, which is good, but also we must not use cancelling of tenders, for instance, at the last minute, in order for us to headhunt or to put in place to do work for those that we love. I'm making a reference, for instance, to what happened in the area of agricultural inputs, where yes, tenders were cancelled, but that led to a lesser process of openness, where then they had to pick people, though the law provides for that, but and picking and going through the process is not as clean as going through the process. So yes, cancellation of tenders, but it must not lead us into sin.
The last one I want to talk about is just the caution. CDF, we have also concerns there that if we are not careful in the way we implement it, that's where we need a lot of work of Anti-Corruption Commission, is that if we don't work well, we can actually be decentralizing corruption. Where senior, previously, or we have seen in the past, where senior public servants are the ones who are involved in corruption, now we will take it down so that even the lower strata also takes part. So we need to be just careful so that we don't decentralize corruption. But also, Director General, also on the other part, on illicit financial transaction, the bank's role, they say, when you have a discussion with them, I'm sure Madam Glenda understands this. The banks are saying, we give you information as law enforcement agencies about illicit financial flow, but we don't see much of the work that we are doing. So they are also asking the law enforcement agencies, not only you, but others as well, to do much more when the information from the banks come. But the big thing is, more people are pointing to the law enforcement agencies, they are complaining, they're even actually condemning the law enforcement agencies. But maybe what we should take the lesson from there is actually people, one, have trust in us. Secondly, they expect us to do much, much more in the fight against corruption. Now back to my speech. May I recognize the presence of Mr. Tom Shamakamba, the Anti-Corruption Commission Director General, the Councillor Mukubesa Nyoni, who is the Councillor for Kalingalinga Ward, representing her worship, the Mayor of Lusaka, Mr. Indifat Sembo, representing Financial Intelligence Center Director General, and Mr. Bob, representing Partnership and Transparency Fund. And I also take cognizant of the presence of a senior citizen, Mr. Dante Sanders, who is with us. May I just say, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. May I also join in extending a warm welcome to you all to this very important launch of the 2022 Corruption Perception Index. As shown in the presentation made earlier, the 2022 CPI gives a worrying revelation that 124 countries have stagnant corruption levels, while the number of countries in decline is also increasing. This has the most serious consequences as global peace is deteriorating and corruption is both a key cause and result of this. Unsurprisingly, most countries at the bottom of the CPI are currently experiencing armed conflict or have recently done so. In the case of Zambia, ladies and gentlemen, we have experienced peace and security since our independence in 1964. However, corruption in the form of political patronage of trading places, bus stations, and public offices, rent-seeking and nepotism in the allocation of public funds and projects, public procurement corruption in the construction of infrastructure and in agriculture inputs, and kickbacks in the purchase of essential goods and services all have the potential to create civil unrest and conflict if allowed to thrive. We will do well, therefore, to fight all these forms of corruption in order to maintain our much cherished peace. Zambia is indeed a clear example that corruption has the potential to generate political and social unrest, which has previously manifested itself in the form of political violence, especially during elections, undermining of government institutions and interference with law enforcement. This may lead to conflict when they coincide with disparities in the distribution of political and economic power.
distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the 2022 CPI for Zambia indicates that the country has maintained its score of 33 out of 100 as compared to 2021. This is below 50. This outturn is against political assurance from the UPND administration that they would improve in the fight against corruption, resulting in the improved CPI score for Zambia. In fact, in response to the results of the 2021 CPI last year, the chief government spokesperson is on record as having pledged that the UPND government, the UPND administration, would improve Zambia's CPI score in no time. The implication of a stagnated score for the third year running is that government and indeed other anti-corruption stakeholders have simply not done enough to change the corruption narrative for the better. The extended implication is that it creates a notion that there is no improvement in the corruption situation, which could potentially create a sense of helplessness. This therefore calls for increased effort from government and other anti-corruption stakeholders in the fight against the vice. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past years, Transparency International Zambia has consistently raised concern on critical anti-corruption interventions, which, if acted upon, would have improved the overall CPI score. These include the enhancement of democratic freedoms through the enactment of favorable freedom of expression and access to information laws. We have also constantly called on the government to take action on the corruption-related issues raised by the Office of the Auditor General, as well as the need for public officials to declare their assets and liabilities and willingly having them published in our media. But alas, the declarations are still being guarded as secret trophies. Further, we have indicated that the national anti-corruption policy has taken too long to be revised, resulting in anti-corruption interventions not being anchored on existential evidence to counter corruption. Nonetheless, we note that the government had an opportunity to come with an effective strategy to guide the renewed anti-corruption efforts immediately it came and assumed power. If there is a new strategy guiding anti-corruption, at least this has not been communicated, and this impacts negatively on the collective anti-corruption action. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past year, Transparency International Zambia and other civil society organizations have also been calling upon government to introduce lifestyle audits for senior government officials. This is the sure way to safeguard public resources through monitoring accumulation of wealth by senior government officials, improve public perception, and to demonstrate that government will not shield officials who are found wanting. This does not seem to be on the priority list of the government yet. Allow me to now give recommendation in line with the 2022 CPI findings for Zambia. Number one, government should expedite the revision of the national anti-corruption policy and to harmonize the various pieces of legislation on anti-corruption, such as the Whistleblowers Act and many others. Without a revised national anti-corruption policy and harmonization of laws, efforts to fight corruption will continue to be informed by outdated strategies, as legal regime will not effectively support anti-corruption and so will not deliver expected outcomes. Number two, government should ensure that the Anti-Corruption Commission and the oversight institutions, such as the Office of the Auditor General, continue to have sufficient resources and independence to perform their mandate. It is encouraging that the 2021 and 2023 national budgets have increased the allocation to law enforcement agencies, and we urge the government to continue on this path in order to improve the operational efficiency of these institutions. Number 3, government should improve information dissemination and uphold the rights to access information by accelerating the enactment of the Access to Information Law in Zambia. There has been limited progress in enacting the Access to Information Law during the past decade. We therefore encourage the Ministry of Information and Media to address the bottlenecks in this process and to see to it that the Access to Information Bill gets enacted into law this year. Achieving this milestone will be a critical input for enhancing the fight against corruption in Zambia. Number 4, government should limit private sector influence on decision-making by regulating political party funding and campaign financing in Zambia. During the past year, law enforcement agencies looking into the sources of funding for political parties have been limited by the absence of legislation governing the financing of political parties and campaigns. We therefore encourage the Ministry of Home Affairs and Internal Security and the Ministry of Justice to make progress with regards to the enactment of this law in line with Article 60, Clause 4 of the Constitution of Zambia. Number 5, government entities such as the Financial Intelligence Center and the Zambia Revenue Authority, as well as other regulators, should take stronger action to combat transnational forms of corruption in order to limit the illicit funding of conflicts. In 2022, Transparency International Zambia conducted a study on illicit financial flows in Zambia and established that the widespread use of cash and the limited oversight on law firms are key risks for illicit financial flows. Number 6, last and not the least, notwithstanding pronouncements on the fight against corruption made thus far, government should move towards demonstrating in practical terms anti-corruption efforts. This should be seen through developing the anti-corruption strategy and communicating it to key stakeholders, depoliticizing the fight against corruption, and taking action against suspected corruption reports being made corruptly, either against members of the government or independent citizens. There have been suspected corruption reports which have been raised by the general public, but there has not been movement to address them. There must not be sacred cows or protectionism in the fight against corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, Transparency International Zambia is hopeful that with more targeted government intervention and support from other stakeholders, the corruption narrative in Zambia can be changed. I am fully confident that if we upscale our efforts and work more earnestly during the year 2023, and we all live by the President's pledge to fight corruption of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that the CPI will register significant improvements in the forthcoming years. With the concerted efforts, commitment, and determination of all of us, it is possible to create a Zambia that is free of corruption. It is now my honor and privilege to declare the 2022 Corruption Perception Index for Zambia officially launched. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the launch of the 2022 CPI report. As we close this session, we would want to invite the high table to come forward for a photo shoot, which will be directed by TIZ's Communication Officer, Zanji Sinkana.
Please come.
It also makes them worse. But most countries are not doing enough to stop it. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index ranks 180 countries and territories by their perceived levels of public sector corruption. It uses a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is highly corrupt and 100 is very clean. This year's results results reveal an unchanging global average, with more than two-thirds of countries scoring below 50. And despite international commitments progress in controlling corruption in the last decade. In the last 5 years, some countries have significantly declined in their CPI score, including rich economies like Austria, Canada, Luxembourg, and the United Kingdom, showing that even high-ranking countries need to keep their eyes wide open. We also witnessed how corruption has made the world a more dangerous place, posing a threat to national and international peace and security. Combined, these threats create a hostile environment where democracy is likely to backslide and authoritarian leaders get more powerful. Despite all this, citizens are raising their voices businesses across the globe. In the last years, many of the biggest protests the world has seen were driven by the people's frustration about corruption in government, with many even risking their lives. Go to transparency.org/CPI to see how your country measures up and what you can do about it. Corruption is the cause of many of the world's most serious problems. It also makes them worse. But most countries are not
The Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and think tanks. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI. The CPI results are comparable across time back to 2012. This is because when we convert the original data to the CPI scale, we take into account the 2012 parameters, which turns 2012 into the baseline year. Annual CPI results from before 2012 cannot be compared to other years. The 13 different data sources used to calculate the CPI all measure various aspects of corruption in the public sector. This ranges from bribery, the diversion of public funds, and the effective prosecution of corruption cases, to adequate legal frameworks, access to information, and legal protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators. The CPI does not measure activities such as tax fraud, money laundering, financial secrecy, or illicit flows of money. Corruption generally involves illegal activities which are deliberately hidden and only come to light through scandals, investigations, or prosecutions. Researchers, civil society, and governments have made advances in measuring corruption in specific sectors. However, to date, there is no index which directly measures real levels of corruption in all its manifestations. The data sources that make up the CPI ask business executives and country experts questions which are based on carefully designed questionnaires. The CPI scores generally correlate with certain objective measures, including citizens' reported experience with bribery. To ensure that the CPI methodology and results are reliable, the index is regularly reviewed by independent evaluators. Such reviews have consistently shown that the CPI is statistically and conceptually coherent. Ultimately, the CPI is the most widely used corruption measurement indicator due to the wide global coverage, the increased reliability which comes with combining different sources, and the fact that it reconciles different points of view on what constitutes public sector corruption. For more information, please visit www.transparency.org/CPI. The Corruption Perceptions Index, also known as the CPI, scores and ranks countries around the world based on how corrupt their public sector is perceived to be. The scores reflect the views of experts or surveys of business people, not the general public. We calculate the CPI using data from 13 different external sources. Transparency International is not involved in the production of any of these 13 datasets. The CPI includes data produced by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, as well as by private risk and consulting companies and think tanks. Each of the 13 sources rates countries using its own scale. One source rates countries on a scale of 1 to 7, for instance, while another uses a scale of 1 to 100. As a result, direct comparison of country scores between different sources is not possible. Therefore, we transform each score from the original scale into standardized values that show the position of each country relative to others. By doing this, we are able to compare country scores across the 13 different data sources. After standardizing all scores, we then convert them into a scale from 0 to 100, which we use for the CPI. Next, we simply calculate the average of the transformed scores for each country. The average score is the CPI value for each country. In order to ensure reliability of the results, only countries with data from at least 3 sources are included in the CPI.